Welcome to Pond Pals Podcast, Episode 3. I'm Honkflap, and I'm here with my husband, Iron Duck.
Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing good.
And our bestie, Big Mike.
Hello, guys, gals, non-binary pals, and waterfowls. It's me, Big Mike, and it's damn good to be here with two of my best friends.
Well, Mike, I have got something for you. I am launching my own little mini-series on this podcast. You have stumbled in to the first episode of Ducky Literature Club, where I get to flex my inner lit nerd and explain poetry to you and my dear, dear husband.
Well, I am definitely aroused. You have definitely aroused my interest. Not just with the name, but also with the literature itself. So, yep, I am definitely, you definitely have me at attention. You definitely have my attention.
Well, we are going to start our Ducky Literature Club with one of my very favorite poets, a man whose works have shaped my entire literary passions for decades now. One William Butler Yeats. And I'm going to give you a little reading here of one of his most famous poems called The Second Coming. And then we're going to talk about the absolute craziness in the imagery here, and a little craziness about old Willie Boy as well. So, with no further ado, The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming! Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it red shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. I want to say I have read this 10,000 times, and I get goosebumps every time I do. This is some fantastic imagery. So, Mike, off the top, what'd you think of it?
It definitely has an apocalyptic feeling to it.
Yes, it does.
It draws on a lot of apocalyptic imagery. The collapse of society, the plagues, war, the end of eras, the changing of the guard. I picked up on a lot of that. I don't want to jump too far ahead of myself here, but that natural interpretation is not too far off from the actual interpretation, at least from what I can gather.
Yep. But why not? Here's the funnest part about poetry, or, well, literature in general. There are generally agreed upon interpretations, but the only person who ever knew what William Butler Yeats truly meant when he wrote this is William Butler Yeats. And he left us a lot of writing, a lot of poetry, a lot of letters, a lot of stuff on politics. But he did not analyze his own poetry for us. So there's a little wiggle room to see stuff in there that may deviate from the sort of accepted academic interpretation of it. But that's the great thing about poetry, right? That, well, or any medium, really, I suppose, any kind of art, really. But what it means is very subjective depending on the person consuming it. So there's really no right or wrong answer. There's just the most agreed upon answer. Ducky, what'd you think?
Yeah, I agree with Mike. Like, the imagery is really profound in this thing. and like some of the phrasing is really like top tier to me. Like the idea that they're just out in the freaking desert, there's this large lion walking around with a man's head that's moves slowly like it's already half dead, already being swarmed by vultures. And the phrase "the ceremony of innocence is drowned" just goes hard. There's no two ways around that. And also something else that is like amidst the entire poem, there is one particular phrase that really sticks out to me, and it's the part where it says "mere anarchy is loosed upon the world." I love how it says "mere anarchy." Like this is some benign crap happening. The entire world has fallen apart. There is all semblance of order has been erased. But this is kind of low on the problems that are happening right now.
Well, that is a very good point. That word, I'm sure, mere, not total anarchy is loosed upon the world, but mere anarchy. In the face of what is slouching toward Bethlehem, the anarchy may very well be the least of your problems. So, Mike, why don't you tell us what you learned about the most common interpretation of this poem and what it means?
Well, so first I just want to talk a little bit about interpretations in general. So when it comes to interpretations, context is king. Context is key. And that's one of the things I tell my students, and that's one of the things, that's one of the principles I work with in my academic life. For those who don't know, in my academic life, I interpret ancient and medieval text. And, and in doing so, to get a good interpretation, you have to put them in their proper context. Now, context here, there's several layers to context. Now, context is going to refer to, on one layer, can refer to the text itself. So what does this verse mean in the greater context of this poem? That's part of it. What does this verse, or what does this poem mean in the greater canon? For example, like, what does this mean? What does this verse mean in the greater collection of the poet's writings? Or what does this poem mean when taken together with other writings? That's another level. And then probably, arguably, one of the most important, if not the most important layer, is the cultural, historical, social, political, economic, and maybe even geographical context in which a work originates in. Now, looking at this was written, if my understanding is correct, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, because I am by no means an expert in this. It was written in the aftermath of the First World War, and also with the ongoing influenza epidemic, or the Great Flu, or as the Blue Death, as it was sometimes called. So there you have your two apocalyptic elements, your great war and your great plague. And here what I can gather is this is about the changing of epochs. So based on some of his other writings, Yeats believed that the world history was divided into epochs. The first being what we can call like a Greek epoch, starting with the Trojan War. And that epoch for Yeats lasted until it was overtaken by the coming of Christianity. When he wrote this, he believed that the epoch of Christianity was coming to an end. And with the changing of epochs, there comes great upheaval. And I'm not sure if that's exactly what he was going for here, because a lot of the imagery he was going for here rings bells to the changing of epochs that we see. Like, for example, the ceremony of innocence is drowned. That makes me think of the murder of the innocents. In the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus is born, Herod has all male children, or all children in general, killed. But I think from 2 years old and younger. Which is also meant to echo what happened in Egypt. The Pharaoh who wanted to kill all the firstborn, well, not all the firstborn, but all the male children. And that's just what it brings to mind. So he's kind of setting up here this change of epochs, and he's drawing on familiar imagery there to echo this point. When, for example, Jesus was born, when the Christian epoch began, at least from certain perspectives, the world was in turmoil. If you lived in Judea, you had this occupying power, this imperial power, Rome, over you, and you were being suppressed to some extent, and you didn't have independence. And so, it was a time of great upheaval and great expectations. And so you had many messiahs to come, or many people claimed to be the Messiah. Many, besides Jesus, there were people like Bar Kokhba, for example. And there were many more, according to Josephus, who was a Jewish historian at the time. But anyway, point being is, it was a time of great upheaval. Many wars were fought. Rome was still expanding to some extent. And so there was wars, and there was also many plagues there at the time as well. And so I think he's drawn on the same imagery to put forth this image that times are changing. He might also be drawing on apocalyptic imagery that you can find in books of the Bible like Daniel or the book of Revelations or the Apocalypse of John. But that's my takeaway.
That is very good. That is very good. And for context, like to answer your question earlier, the poem was written in 1919 and published in 19.
Oh, yeah. So that would have been...
There's a... Oh, no, go ahead.
Yeah, so that would have been right as like shortly after the First World War and right as the flu epidemic was taken off.
This is true. Then that would be, by the way, the Spanish flu is what it is usually referred to in American history texts.
Yeah, in North Carolina, we called it the blue flu. And because it had this, it would turn your skin blue because you would have the chills. It would give you the chills. And so it would turn patients, their skin blue. And so, yeah, so that's why I called it the blue flu. And some people do call it, but yeah, it's definitely the Spanish flu. Definitely the Spanish flu.
Okay. Now, here's where we get to the fun part, right? There's a little picky apart thing. What you may or may not know is that Yeats, and this is very, very in keeping with his time period, the late 19th and early 20th century was an absolute explosive time for occultism, mysticism, and Gnosticism. Those things were everywhere, and people loved them. People were fascinated by them. You may have heard stories about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle being absolutely obsessed with seances. If you haven't, it's a good story. You should look it up. You should look into Arthur Conan Doyle, and boy howdy, did that man love a good seance. But William Butler Yeats is one of the founding members of the Order of the Golden Dawn, which is probably the most famous theosophical society to come out of Europe or North America. Probably ever. Still exists today, by the way. And the imagery in the most famous tarot card deck, the White's Rider, is largely based on iconography from the Order of the Golden Dawn. So bearing that in mind, let me tell you that he wrote this in 1919. He was married in 1917 to a woman called Georgina, and who went by George. It was like her little nickname. In the same year that they got married, his first child, a daughter, was born. And then 2 years after that, in 1921, his son was born. So when we look, and bear in mind, Yeats was an Irishman. So his upbringing would have been Irish Catholic. And when you look at that line you pointed out about the ceremony of innocence is drowned, that is a dark, this can be seen. I see this as a very dark reference to the rite of baptism. I think that's the ceremony of innocence that has been drowned. But we'll get to it. We'll get to why I think that. But let's start at the very beginning of our poem, okay? We have turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. This, very clearly to me, speaks of a complete loss of control. You got a falconer, he's thrown his bird out, the bird is just flying in circles above him, and he's calling the bird, but the bird can't hear him, so it doesn't know it's being called back. This situation is now out of control. And then his most famous line, this is probably the most famous line that Yeats ever penned, and it is quoted a million times in a million different pieces of media. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. So when you think of that bird flying in a circle, like if you think of, you make a little whirlpool in water. In the middle, it's tight, but as it expands out, the center starts getting looser and looser until it just finally stops even rippling. He's seeing time like that. I believe he's seeing time like that, and he's calling back to that image of the bird. Then he has this mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. Pretty straightforward. As Ducko pointed out, that word mere, though, is telling. That really, really suggests to me that, yep, we're having anarchy, and it is not our biggest issue by any stretch of the imagination. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. So I think that's a very clear reference in my mind. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed to the First World War, which was by far the biggest, the most deadly, the most horrible conflict the world had known to that point. No other war compared in terms of casualties to the First World War. It was a monstrous thing. And it's interesting. Think about that for a minute. How do you grapple with something of that magnitude? You know what I'm saying? Like, how do you get your head around that? In a typical war, 10,000 people die, 20,000 people die, 100,000 people die. And then compare that to the casualties of the trench warfare of the First World War and the awful ways in which they died. The absolute crazy, fanatically bizarre ways in which they die. We have the ceremony of innocence is drowned, perhaps in that blood-dimmed tide, but also possibly a reference to the rite of baptism. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. This, I think, is where you were, like the real big tell for me, about what you were saying about he sees the age of Christianity ending. The best lack all conviction. The people who were supposed to be the moral backbone of society, the people who were the arbiters of good and evil, right and wrong, no longer have conviction. Their faith has faded. It's all just lip service now. There's no real energy left in Christianity, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Certainly, the people who started the First World War, the politicians behind it, the people who fed into it, the people who profited from it, the people who sustained it, it's pretty easy to say that they were full of passionate intensity, and yes, they are absolutely the worst. So we have this kind of setup for everything sucks, but whatever, it's gonna get worse, boys, because surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. I am going to draw your attention to that line and to the third from the last line of the poem. Ducky, would you read that line there, the third one from the bottom?
Let's see. We're vexed to a nightmare by a rocking cradle.
So that seems like he is predicting a second coming of a child, like Christ's birth, right? The second Christ, perhaps, but we know that's not true because this second coming is clearly a sphinx, the head of a body, or the head of a body. Good job, Goosey. The head of a lion. No, try again. The head of a man, body of a lion, and the desert. That just screams Great Sphinx, right? That's what's slouching to Bethlehem to be born. But something vexed it. A rocking cradle. And here is where, if you are familiar with Yeats' biography, you might know that he was passionately intense about his mysticism and his occultism, something I can absolutely get behind. I get that entirely. But what you may not know is that this guy was full of himself. Oh my Lord. This man, this whole ass man, this man was his own biggest fan. So I believe he wrote this in 1919 after the birth of his child, because he believed that his child, either this one or the one that would come 2 years later, to be this incredibly spiritual, powerful force that would wake the Sphinx. That's what I think is going on here. And it's great. It is great. The arrogance that William Butler Yeats had was just amazing, because he was simultaneously, oh, I love this about the man so much. He was simultaneously the world's biggest egotist, but he was also ridiculously insecure. The dichotomy here is crazy. It seems like half the poems he wrote were him mooning over this woman. He was desperately in love with this woman, and she didn't like him in that way. They were friends, but, bro was friend-zoned over here. And he just moped. He moped in verse, but he just moped. And when I told you he got married in 1917, he married Georgina. He married George after the woman that he was truly in love with rejected his proposal. Georgina had her cap set for him from the first time they met. Georgina was all about some Willie B here, but she was his consolation prize. He just married her because the woman he truly loved would not marry him. Isn't it crazy to think about how you can be so full of yourself and at the same time just be so hopeless in a romantic setting?
I think there might be a connection.
What you got for me, Mike?
I think there might be a connection there. People tend to overcompensate. People tend to overcompensate. So, if you lack in one thing, maybe you're trying to make up for it in something else. So he couldn't have the girl or the woman of his dreams, so he's going to puff himself up to be the second coming, or his offspring to be the second coming. So yeah, that does make sense. And also,
very good point.
And also, you brought up the fact that, how could somebody be so arrogant? So how could somebody be so arrogant, full of themselves, and also so insecure? You see that in a lot of political leaders, especially a lot of dictators and would-be dictators. On the one hand, they say, oh, I'm loved by my people. And on the other hand, they have a very, very tight grip on their people, so their people don't have free choice. So I think that's a very common.
I'm about to knock your socks off, Mike. It is hilarious that you said that. Because did you know that when the Republic of Ireland gained its independence from Great Britain, one William Butler Yeats became an Irish senator?
I did not know that. I did not know that. Whoa.
Look at Mike over here sniping from 100 years in the future. Calling them shots.
I'm telling you, the guy is a brilliant writer. Absolutely brilliant writer. But this whole ass man is a story in and of himself. He would make a great HBO special or Netflix miniseries. The Life and Times of William Butler Yeats. This guy, oh my Lord, there is so much about this man. And it's one of the reasons I love his work so much, is that the man himself is fascinating. And he crossed paths with some of the most important people of his time period. And he seemingly bluffed his way or fell ass backwards into positions of historical significance. I don't know that William Butler Yeats was qualified to be a senator in any meaningful way. I don't think he was particularly well versed in law. I don't think he was particularly well versed in commerce. I don't think he was particularly well versed in anything that you would want a leader to be well versed in. I don't think he had a great deal of military knowledge. He was from the word jump. He was a poet. He always had been. The man wrote. He made his living doing this, right? And he gained a fair amount of infamy with the Order of the Golden Dawn. Now, one of the people of all times who joined the Order of the Golden Dawn, but wound up, surprise, surprise, being way more trouble than he was worth and wound up getting kicked out, was everyone's favorite occultist, Aleister Crowley. I don't know if you know that Crowley went on to found the Order of the Silver Star after he was kicked out of the Order of the Golden Dawn, but he did.
That sounds like, you ever see that meme, Mom, can we have McDonald's? Oh, we have McDonald's at home. That's what that sounds like. Order of the Morning Star, you say it was called? Or Silver Star?
Silver Star, yeah.
That sounds like the Sam's Choice version of the Golden Dawn.
Oh, Golden Dawn. Well, that is a whole other story in and of itself. That went off the rails. Old boy was all about sex and drugs. That's all he was really interested in. And he basically just found a bunch of people, mumbled something about Thelema, something about an emerald tablet, and then he just wanted to practice magic, which meant having as much crazy sex as possible while getting high as fuck on heroin and opium. That was his path to spirituality, by the way, which is probably why the very proper and very arrogant Yeats did not want him around and threw him out on his can.
Wasn't there a thing about Crowley where like he wanted to have sex with like the dwarves and like amputees and such like that because his theory was that because they don't have a lot of sex in the first place, the quote-unquote sexual energy is more pent up and there's greater amounts to be quote-unquote harvested during rituals?
Okay, you're half right. He did, in fact, want to have sex with amputees, dwarves, midgets, hunchbacks, all of that. But his reckoning wasn't that because they don't have a lot of sex, they exude more sexual energy. He thought there was more sexual energy, but it wasn't because they didn't have sex. It was because their energy was twisted, and that was reflected in their bodies.
Oh, okay.
You know, like if you got too much of this really twisty energy, then you turn out to be a hunchback with a lazy eye or something.
Yeah.
So he did actually put out advertisements in the New York newspapers of New York City for a while, looking for such people to have sex with in a ritual setting. But he was just a fucking degenerate. Yeah, I'm sorry. There's no other way to say it. Crowley was just a degenerate. He really was.
Crowley was the original Diddy.
So,
no. I don't think there were any kids involved. I don't think there were any kids involved.
Really interesting. I think it was Crowley, but it might have been LeVay. I all think get those two mixed up. But apparently, at some point in time, he was in Egypt, and he seriously considered converting to Islam. He was seriously considering
that was Crowley.
But he said he claimed he heard Hermes, the Greek messenger god for the gods from Greek mythology, calling out to him from the pyramids. And so...
Well, it's close. It was Hermes Trismegistus, which is actually a kind of a fusion between the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. But he based a lot of his stuff on Egyptian iconography. But Hermes Trismegistus is supposed to be like the original sorcerer, What is that guy's name? Count Saint Germain was thought perhaps to be Hermes Trismegistus because he supposedly was immortal.
Some
Um, it, it's a great bit of lore. And once you start getting into these bookish types, let me tell you something about 19th century poets. Once you start digging in to these 19th century poets, you find some stuff that would put any soap opera to shame. To absolute shame. The things these fuckers got up to. And it's such a jarring image. I mean, you want to think about a poet and you're like, here's this kind of moody, sensitive dude staring out at the sunset. Then he goes and he writes some stuff down. Oh my lord. No, that is not what they were rocking. That is not how it was going down. These guys, there's some hot messes in the poetry world. Crazy stuff, absolutely crazy stuff. But before I go absolutely hog wild on Crowley here, let me cycle back to Yeats, right? So Yeats here in his poem seems to be suggesting that Christianity. This is the where's my line here? The 20 centuries of stony sleep. That's the 2,000 years that people were, or Europe was a Christian nation or whatever. He genuinely believed, I think. I don't think any of Yeats's beliefs were grifty. I don't think he was like a con artist. Crowley was largely a con artist. But I'm pretty sure Yeats was sincere about this. But he really, really thought that this era of Christianity was gone, and that it was the thing that was holding the world together into some kind of cohesive, workable structure. If you had all of Europe basically practicing the same religion, answering to the same authorities, the same popes, or I guess in the case of like England, the king is the head of the church. But you had just a few key religious figures. Everyone's mostly on the same page. Everyone has a similar framework. Then it's pretty easy to keep everything 5 by 5, not nice and on rails there. But he really thought it was over. He really thought it was over. And I do believe that he believed that the Second World War, I am full of it tonight. The First World War was, in fact, the kind of signaling of the end of that era. Because, quite frankly, there's no way you can reconcile what happened in that world with anything that approaches Christian values or morality or anything else. There's just no way. Those things are completely incompatible. And to have it break out on such a large scale, a literal world war, he figures it's Jover. It is just Jover. But instead of moving into a new era, where you just got your period of chaos until the new better thing takes over, he was very much predicting a new worse thing. A much worse thing. The era of this beast. This rough beast, whose hour has come round at last, and is slouching its way toward Bethlehem. He was literally predicting the end of the world. So anyway, it's a cool poem, and I really like it. And I really like Yeats. And boy, howdy, will I yap at you about some of the carryings on about these guys. One interesting thing is that his wife, George, was very much a part of the Golden Dawn, and very much into the occultism. And I had this one professor who was incredibly indulgent of my passion for Yeats. One Dr. Patrick Smith, rest in peace, my dear friend. He was a huge inspiration for me when I was in college. And he was absolutely fine with me being Yeats crazed. And he would actually let me lecture his classes sometimes. When he would get to Yeats in one of his world literature classes, he'd be like, "Hey, you want to come speak?" And they'd be like, yes, I get to talk about Yeats. People have to listen to me because they need to attend class to get credit. This is amazing. But
you just get up in front of the class. Hello, good morning, hostages.
Basically, yes. I was like, man, I am born to stand behind a podium. Hoo-ha. Listen to me. But one of the things that that Yeats did that was really fascinating, and this is what I wrote my big paper on for Patrick's class, was Yeats was a contemporary of another very fascinating poet by the name of William Blake, who was also a mystic, more of a Gnostic than an occultist, and possibly schizophrenic. There's some weird stuff going on with Blake, but Blake is fabulous. His works are fabulous, and he's got an incredible backstory as well. But the two men were contemporaries. They never met. But Yeats would insinuate that they did. And he would sort of humble brag by calling Blake his master, sort of giving people the impression that he was Blake's understudy, which was not true at all. It just wasn't true. But Blake had a lot of notoriety and would have been 20, 30 years older than Yeats. So it's kind of funny. It would be kind of like me reading Yeats and then telling people that Yeats was my master, which implies that I'm his student. Yeah, go ahead.
So, and what was it? Is it sure? Are we sure that he was being literal when he said that, or is it possible that he could have been just speaking figuratively? Because I'll give you an example of this. It
could have been figurative.
In my own writing, in my own work, Ralph Waldo Emerson plays a huge role, and so I'll often say, I learned from the Sage of Concord, which that was one of his nicknames. Emerson's nicknames, and even though he was born in the 1800s and he died in the 1880s, and I was born almost 100 years later, so I didn't literally learn from him, but I didn't literally learn directly from him. So,
really influenced by.
Yeah, I was influenced by. I learned from his writings, but. Do you think that could be a similar situation between Blake and Yeats, or do you think Yeats was just he was extending the truth a little bit?
I feel like it was the second one. Given his general character, I think that as a young man he was name dropping Blake, because by the way, then and now, it's not easy to make a living as a poet. I mean, it's just not something that makes you fat stacks being a poet. That's just not how it works out. So Blake needed patrons. Found one. He found a woman with a huge manor and all of this, and a pond full of swans and all of that, and she basically sponsored him. He lived on her estate for a long time. She gave him, money for food and clothes and this and that. And he dedicated a lot of his works to her and her estate and so on and so forth. And I think he was name-dropping Blake to give himself some credentials, because Blake was very well known. Not necessarily very well loved, but very well known. Blake certainly had his detractors, because Blake, for instance, liked to play Garden of Eden with his wife, and his neighbors found that scandalous. His wife found that scandalous. But he liked to make his wife get naked and go stand in the backyard eating apples, and then he'd wander out there naked and, engage in congress with her.
Bro literally was writing pornos before the TVs existed.
Role play is not a new thing, people.
No, it's not. It
no,
is,
but that
it
just
is
sounds
not.
like some lazy porno story right there. Oh no, look, a totally naked woman. Oh no, look what totally happened by accident. Oh dear me.
Oh, you reached up and grabbed an apple? Why, I have a baby arm clutching an apple for you.
Yeah, we'll get. Well, one of these nights we will get into Blake, and I'll give you his whole backstory. but his poetry was considered sublime. The man himself was a scandal. But you know, the high society, as much as people think of like the Victorians as being excessively prude and all of that, behind closed doors, these guys were not at all above some sketchy behavior. I mean, that wasn't out of the realm of possibility. They didn't genuinely faint at the thought of an immoral practice. They would certainly like you to think that they did, but they absolutely did not. The Victorians were some crazy, crazy people in terms of just like hedonism. They were incredibly hedonistic, or the aristocracy among them. All of that propriety and piety was the lower aristocracy and what they called the middling classes. But anyhow, boy, from Blake, and I kind of agree with his assessment that in the early 20th century, I do think that marked a significant decline in the genuine fervor that the masses held for Christianity. I think that is the point where the true believers started being outnumbered by the kind of it's proper, let's pay lip service to it kinds of religious folk. And I actually think the Industrial Revolution had a lot to do with that. Myself. That's something that's not really ever cited when people talk about this particular poem. They talk about the Spanish flu. They talk about World War I. They talk about these great catastrophic things. But I don't think people give enough credence to the level of catastrophe that the Industrial Revolution was for 19th century society and early 20th century society.
So, wait a minute,
because
Bestie.
people like to look at it. Yeah.
So, the catastrophe of the Industrial Revolution, you think you could rephrase that?
Well, I think it could be said that the Industrial Revolution and its consequences are a disaster for the human race. I think you might be able to make that point. I think you could argue that cogently.
As soon as you mentioned the Industrial Revolution, I swear I could hear Tsar Khan's head turn wherever that cat is. I mean, just the slow head turn. They're using my line.
The ears pricking up.
Oh.
Wait.
Wait,
are we on this subject now?
Ears turn to whichever direction we currently are in regards to his location. Full on cat mode activated.
Exactly.
I hear the take that saying my song. No, I can't do his voice. So
no, you can't. That was horrible. That sounded like a drunk Elvis. I don't know where that came from. I don't know what that was, but
that's definitely going to be
for the record. No, the what? That's going to be what?
That's definitely going to be the teaser for the week this episode comes out.
Well, I'll tell. Okay, for those of you
like
who
30
don't know,
seconds short, and you can tag him in it also, and it's just me. I hear them saying my song.
Yeah, and you still sound like drunk Elvis. But anyway, for those people listening who do not know, the Tsar Khan and Mikey will absolutely link him, I'm sure, in the description here, along with the link to the poem that we're talking about. But the Tsar Khan is a friend of ours and of Mikey's, and he is a streamer who is a sort of classically you would call him a VTuber, but he does not like that term. I think he calls himself an internet persona. I think the nomenclature he prefers. But he's a jaguar. He's a jaguar who is a professional wrestler. And he's got a really good voice. And he doesn't sound anything at all like those noises my husband just made. He does not sound like that. Just go.
Tsar as a streamer is one of those things that I literally can't describe. The best like metaphor I have for Tsar is the Twitch version of Prince. There is literally nothing I can say to describe him other that he is so himself that he is his own category. Like you can go to a Walmart store, or go to wherever. You can look up all the music albums and such. Every one of them's going to have a sticker that says country, rock, pop, whatever. But I have never seen any freaking store label a Prince album anything other than Prince. Like it actually prints out Prince on that same label. That's how I think of Tsar. Like Tsar is his own thing. There's no point in trying to describe it. You know what? Yeats couldn't describe him.
Oh, if the man were still alive, he would bitch slap you for saying that.
Yeah, well, I'm not the one with a superiority complex and have an inferiority complex about my superiority complex. So I'm not Buffy the Vampire Slayer over here.
So was another poet that comes into this mix, right? An Italian fellow named, he was an American fellow who moved to Italy. Anyway, his name is Ezra Pound. And
I know Ezra.
He was actually pretty influential. He founded a kind of school of poetry called Imagism. And like the idea behind this sort of movement that he founded was a sort of precision. A very economic use of a very deliberate economic use of language was his thing. But he actually wound up becoming a fascist, like literally a fascist. He was a big fan of Benito Mussolini, and like Yeats, was much younger than Blake, and claimed him as his master. Ezra Pound claimed Yeats as like one of his biggest inspirations, and he wanted to speak with Yeats to really get in the man's head to learn about him, and Yeats would have nothing to do with him. With this young American who couldn't possibly know his ass from his elbow, and Pound literally just sucked up to Yeats and flattered him to the point that Yeats allowed him to be in his presence. It's craziness. It's absolute craziness.
No, it's just the idea that Yeats and what was his name? Blake. Yeats would claim that Blake was like he was such a huge guy for the Blake poet, and and then just the idea that like some other dude, what was it, Ezra Pound? Yeah, hell of a name, by the way. But and Ezra Pound does literally the same thing to Yeats, and Yeats is just like, ew, no. I'm literally imagining the little scene in Family Guy where Stewie just starts like something happens and Stewie's like grossed out. He's just like flailing his wrist really hard. Ew, ew, ew. That's how I'm imagining Yeats when you're telling this story.
Oh, the beef.
So Pound actually managed to talk his way into becoming Yeats' secretary and wound up living with him for like 3 years.
Oh God.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing.
The idea of having to live with someone who keeps fangirling about you was just unnerving. That could be a horror movie right there.
Yeah. So really fun fact about Pound.
Yep.
Pound actually he did.
Call it the third coming.
So.
Oh God.
So really interesting fact about Pound.
Go ahead, Bestie.
Pound, he actually did a translation of the Analects of Confucius. He was in love with Confucius because if you don't know anything about Confucianism is very traditionalist, very, very traditionalist, and very, very, very much to the idea of submitting to the ruler, submitting, to who they call the Son of Heaven, and Ezra Pound, he he believed that Confucianism was very, very much aligned or compatible with fascism. And he saw Benito Mussolini as being, quote unquote, the son of heaven. And if you're not familiar with Confucianism, that's actually a load of shit. That's a load of bullshit, because in order to be considered a just ruler, you have to do what's best for your people. You have to follow certain guidelines. You have to put, your people before yourself. So you wouldn't, for example, partake of pleasure that you wouldn't share with your people, for example. And if you don't know anything about fascism is people all up at the top have it all, and maybe occasionally they'll toss a bone down to the people below. Maybe.
Right.
So Ezra Pound was full of shit. And honestly, I don't think Yeats was hypocritical for not wanting to associate with him. I mean, Blake didn't want to associate with Yeats, but Yeats, for as whatever shortcomings he may have had, at least he wasn't a fascist. So I mean,
well, he didn't want to associate with Ezra Pound until Ezra Pound flattered him enough, and then he lived with the man for 3 years. So you know what I'm saying here. But yeah, it's just I'm telling you, these people are amazing. There's a wealth of stories, and they're all just so intertwined. But yeah, Pound in himself is a character. He loves Confucius, he loves Mussolini, and he loves Yeats. Those are 3 points that cannot form a triangle, no matter how hard you try to make them. I mean, that there's just no sense to any of that.
Well, to be fair,
it's just amazing. Just amazing.
Maybe I might have an area of overlap there. Maybe. So apparently, from what I remember, and I might be wrong about this, but if I remember correctly, the Irish sided with the Axis during the Second World War. And Yeats was, I'm not sure if Yeats was still active in politics at the time, or even if he was still alive at the time. And of course, so, there would have been a connection there between Ireland and Italy. Now, maybe it's just tangential, maybe it's just coincidence. But maybe there could be some overlap there, perhaps.
Well, now Yeats wasn't okay. Yeats died in 1939, so he would have been there for the beginning of World War II. He would have certainly been there during Hitler's original invasion of Austria and stuff like that. I don't know that. I'm going to have to look it up. I don't know that he was still a senator. Let me see if I can get the years on that.
And also, I'm not saying that the Irish sympathize necessarily with the Germans, the Japanese, or the Italians. As I'm not saying that they necessarily did that, but it could very well be possible that they would just hey, these guys are fuck the British, and we're fuck the British too. So.
Okay, so Yeats was appointed to the Senate in 1922, and he served for 6 years. So he was no longer a senator after 1928. So no, he would not have been a political figure at that time. But and there's another poet that I want to get to eventually that Yeats discovered. Well, I say discovered. It wasn't like he was lost. But there is a brilliant poet called Rabindranath Tagore, who was from what was then British India. Now it would be Bangladesh. But he discovered Tagore's works and brought them to England. And Tagore was... who Tagore reminds me of? Oh my gosh. Come on, Vicky, think of the name. The very famous Iranian poet. Famous Persian poet. Let me type that into Google. I bet it comes up. My head is stuck on Yanni, but that's the guy who plays the saxophone.
How old is the person?
Oh,
Like,
very,
oh,
very.
so it could be Sadi, it could be Omar Khayyam, Hafiz maybe, uh, Rumi perhaps.
Rumi. Yeah, Rumi. Tagore reminds me of Rumi. And his stuff is nothing like Yeats. His stuff is deeply joyful, just passionately joyful. But yeah, it's just amazing. And I hope that over time I'll be able to get you and Ducko as invested in the wonders of these 19th century poets as I am. Because, oh man, their stories are just fabulous. But on that note, I'll take any random questions from the floor, and then I'll muzzle it for a while. I've been yapping like crazy. My throat's going out on me.
Well,
Echo?
I've been over here like looking this thing over, and I don't know. Maybe I'm just maybe this is part of the reason why I like having the idea of my complete noob self who don't know anything about all this stuff gets to read the stuff, and I come out of it with something completely freaking different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. See,
Tell me what you came out of it with.
like I'm like reading this stuff and like I'm looking at this and I'm just like the best way I could say this is I'm thinking like I'm reading this and what this poem to me is like a poem of complete and total despair to me.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But like in like a different sense. Like the first thing to me like okay, I want to say this whole like I guess first half of the poem maybe.
Mm-hmm.
The turning and turning, widening gyre, falcon cannot hear the falconeer. Things fall apart, center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. To me, that sounds like I like if I like read this whole thing, blood dim, tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned, the best like all conviction, while the worst are full of passion and intensity. Like, okay, to this that whole part to me seems like the like I would say probably like of course I'm looking at it from like a today perspective kind of ideal. To me, this seems like the world has completely like fallen apart in like some of the worst ways. Like the falcon cannot hear the falconeer and such. That makes me think of like how the things that should guide a person or people into what to do and how to do it and such like that's gone. People can't understand that. It's been lost. This it falls apart, the center cannot hold, and mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. And that's why I think the mere anarchy thing is mere anarchy. It's like it's not just the chaotic factor. It's like it's how something far worse, far more important was lost, other than just simple order and such. I'm just like thinking, and I'm looking, blood dim, tide is loosed, and I actually say that I'm like, it's sunset. That's just how I saw it. I'm like, okay, a blood dim tide is loose. That sounds like sunset to me. They're just being flowery with it, and the ceremony of innocence is drowned during sunset. Okay, yeah. And it's like the best last all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. My first thought to this was I'm like, this sounds like a very unique way of describing that movie, The Purge. Like I say that in the sense that it seems like when it starts to get dark. Because you remember how that movie was, the next 12 hours, anything you can do is legal and such like that. You don't have to worry about it or whatever like that. In that kind of situation, I can see where the best people would lack the conviction to go out and do what is actually right, while the worst are full of passionate intensity to go do whatever they want to freaking do. Hence more mere anarchy and such. And if I wanted to be silly, I could sit here and say the best like all conviction, while the worst are full of passion and intensity. Yeats just called Twitter. They're just bam. Mike shot the shot 100 years in the past, and Yeats just backhanded it back out and called Twitter. But
Well, Ducky.
yeah.
Ducky. The this particular poem, now you've heard me yap about it for 15 years now, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm like super obsessed with this. But and nobody else knows this, I don't think Mike knows this, but our favoriteest TV show is a space opera called Babylon 5. And this poem actually is in Babylon 5. Do you remember that, Duck?
Oh, there are two ways I know of this poem, and one is from you, and the second is from that show. Yes.
Yep.
So, if I were to continue into the whole second part, this whole surely some revelation is at hand, surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi, which I had to look up, troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape of lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast its hour come round at last slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. So, like, in this one, I'm, like, taking my whole, like, absolute, like, just despair, madness is kind of, like, taking hold of the world kind of situation. And I hear this whole, surely some revelation is at hand. Like, to me, that actually sounds like this person would be actually praying and begging that something is going to happen to change how things are going to be. And then, as he's doing it, he actually has a vision of a freaking sphinx moving through the desert, and only because something far worse than all the stuff this person already knows exists is making the sphinx run towards it. And that's how I was seeing this, actually. Like,
no, that's a perfectly valid interpretation, because, like I was saying, when you're interpreting literature, there's a term that gets thrown around.
I was just about to say, I am literally doing the death of the author epitome. I am the epitome of death of the author right now. Me,
yes,
who doesn't know any of the guy's background or any of the timeline or whatever, I'm gonna look at this and see what I see.
Well, that is on the internet. People use death of the author, kind of weirdly. On Twitter, when people say that, they tend to mean who the author isn't relevant to the work. So you can like a piece of media written by a problematic person for the media itself. I guess J.K. Rowling is like the big boogie woman of Twitter or whatever. So you could like Harry Potter, or you can make the case that the work Harry Potter is a good work of fiction, regardless of what you think of J.K. Rowling as a person. But that's not really where the guy who came up with that phrasing, death of the author, was going when he was talking about it originally. What it originally was meant is that once a piece of art is put out into the world, it no longer matters what the intention of the artist was, because its meaning is subjective to every viewer or reader of that piece of art, or listener in the case of music. That your control over it ends the moment you publish it. So you are absolutely using death of the author as intended in that way. That's what it means to you. Then, from your context, that's what it means. But that's the joy of the thing, is to have people with differing perspectives looking at different pieces and parts of it, picking it apart, dickering, debating, yapping endlessly, which is clearly, in case, dear listeners, you did not know this, my husband and I yap near constantly at each other. It is never quiet in this house. We be yapping. We just do. And we will yap endlessly. And if we weren't yapping about Yeats and we weren't recording this right now, we could be yapping about anything. We have had conversations that stretched on for days about Buffy the Vampire Slayer. It just happens. But that's what I love about it. So with that, Mike, any closing thoughts, opinions, ideas?
A couple things, actually. A couple things. So first, I need to issue a clarification. So I was actually a bit wrong when I said the Irish sympathize with the Axis. So apparently they were both pro-fascist and anti-fascist sentiments in Ireland. So I just want to clarify that. Secondly, I wanted to. Well, there are two other things I want to talk about here. One, I want to mention something you previously mentioned, like way back, and then something. I want to say something about what you guys were just talking about here. Something that I kind of struggle with myself is the intention of the writer versus my interpretation. There's a debate over exegesis and eisegesis. Exegesis means you're going to bring something out, you can bring an interpretation out. Eisegesis is you're reading an interpretation into something. I believe that every work has a message that it conveys, or messages, I should say, that it conveys. Also, there is a message or an interpretation that we have as well, because everybody's going to interpret something differently, because we're all colored by our own unique experiences. We all have our own ways of looking at things, our own preconceived notions, our own fields of knowledge in which we come from. And so I just kind of struggle a bit with trying to keep that balance between, okay, what does this mean to me, and what's the meaning that it has, that the author intended, that the meaning it has within its own cultural, social, political, economic, geographical context as well. So, and it's an interesting line to walk. It's a very, very interesting line to walk, and
are you familiar with the idea of deconstructing poetry? Do you know what I mean by that?
Oh, maybe
well, let me give you a TLDR, because this is what academics who ivory tower types, people who do this for a living, people who write huge papers that get peer reviewed in literary journals, right? They love to do this thing called deconstructing poems. And when you're deconstructing a poem, you are looking intensely at its structure, its language, its allegories, its metaphors, all of that, in order to question the interpretations of it and expose multiple interpretive possibilities. The idea that this thing means that in poetry, that's just not a thing for people who are super into poetry. One thing doesn't mean there is no one clear meaning to any piece of poetry for poetry nerds. That's probably a better way to put it. But the whole point of deconstructing it is to find multiple valid interpretations of it, and that's a little embarrassing to admit, but that's what poetry people do. That's what they're into. It's kind of a thing. So it doesn't really. The idea that there is a distinct meaning to it, a valid meaning, this is what it means, is not something that people who get really into interpreting poetry would be on board with. Yep. Excuse me. Oh, my voice is going. Ducky, I need tea.
Oh, we'll get some in a bit.
Yeah, that's actually a point in my field as well. Most people will say that texts, and myself included, would say that most texts are polyvalent or polyvalent, and that means a text has multiple interpretations or multiple meanings, or a verse can have multiple interpretations or multiple meanings. So yep, I definitely agree with that. Yep, and also the other point I wanted to bring up is that you actually raised an interesting point earlier when you said that the World War One was pretty much the collapse of the old order, the old Christian order, and I didn't really think I never really thought about the First World War in this context, but when I was thinking about it, 3 of the 4 major branches of Christianity were involved in that war. You had, you had the Protestants, most famously the Anglican Church, which is headed by the King of England.
Right.
Secondly, you had Catholics in various Western European nations who took part of it.
Italy, probably most famously, and France was very Catholic, I believe.
And then you also had the Eastern Orthodox. You had with the Russians, with the Russians, the Russian Orthodox Church, as well, and also in Serbia. In Serbia, where Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. That's the Serbian Orthodox Church too. So you had 3 of the 4 major branches of Christianity involved in this. And the only branch that wasn't, to the best of my knowledge, was the Oriental Orthodox, and those were like the Coptic Orthodox, the Ethiopian Orthodox, the Mar Thoma Syrian Christians of India, and the Syrian Orthodox Church as well, and a couple of more, and the Armenian Church too. The Armenian Church too. So anyway, so. Yeah, you had 3 of the 4 major branches of Christianity, and for all intents and purposes, all the 3 main branches in Europe. And when I say, and just to kind of give some light into this situation, this how far they had kind of fallen. Now, this wasn't. You have to kind of understand that at this time, it wasn't like the king in one country was a complete stranger to the king in another country. Most of the royalty in Europe at the time were related. Like the kings in Germany and in England at the time, they were cousins. They were literal family. And the fact that they would go to war with their own family. And it wasn't like they even had like beef with each other directly. It was just because England was allied with Russia, and Germany was allied with the Hungarian or the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. That's the only reason they went to war with each other. So the fact that they would throw their morals and values out the window and attack their own family. I can definitely kind of see where Yeats is coming from when he says that when he believes that the old order is collapsing. Yeah. And also when you consider that the King of England was essentially the head of the Anglican Church, which is pretty much the Pope of the Anglican Church. I can definitely see where he's coming from with that. I never really looked at it in that kind of that light before, but that does make a lot of sense. I guess for many, for many people living at the time, it definitely had to look like the old order was passing, the old epoch was passing, or had passed. So that gave me a lot to think about. That really, really gave me a lot to think about.
Well, I'm glad it did, because that's the whole fun of these kinds of discussions for me, is the back and forth interpretations and like seeing things in different perspectives, having new ideas, new trains of thoughts. I think it's great. I think it is great fun. And I hope you guys had fun too.
Yeah, it was a great thing. I liked it.
Oh, it definitely got my rocks off, bestie. I very much enjoy interpretations. Very, very, very.
Mike had the third coming.
Yep.
Now I'm gonna give a little spoiler here. I'm gonna give a little not really spoiler, a little teaser. But for those of you folks who like poetry and such. The next time that we do a Ducky Literature Club episode, I want to talk about Charles Baudelaire. So, very, very, very rowdy dude. Ooh. NSFW kind of poetry, man. Cool stuff. The Flowers of Evil.
And that'll be the forthcoming. All right, I'm done.
So we're going to expect. We can expect to hear this sound quite a lot in the next Ducky Literature Club episode.
Club, yeah.
I'm over here stroking my dick. I got lotion on my dick.
Well, that's up to you. The NS, there's certainly a lot of sexual references. They're mainly for shock value, but you gotta
figure out how to say that in that 19th century poet way.
We'll see where it goes.
But yeah, I plan on going into the episode. Well, I'm not going to say I'm going to go in completely blind, but I'm not going to do any research until the day before. So I want to try to keep my shock value as legit as possible,
high as possible.
Yep, as high as possible. So, all right. So you want to close us out, Bestie?
Absolutely. Thanks everyone for listening to this episode, number 3 of the Pond Pals podcast. I've been Honkflap, your poetry yapper.
Right,
my husband here,
Duck.
the husband and sidekick, and Bestie, close us out.
And that's it. You lovely guys, gals, non-binary pals, and waterfowls. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we will be back at some point in time in the future. And whenever that is, it's going to be my turn to host. So until next time, remember, just be yourself and you'll be awesome. Peace out.